Welcome to the SBCA podcast, Component Connection, where we explore the people, ideas, trends, and innovations shaping the structural framing industry. Regardless of how you touch this industry, we're glad you're here. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Component Connection. I will be your host for this episode. My name is Abby Langenberg. I am the Director of Business Development for SBCA, and as always, joined today by my co-host, Jess Lohse, and we will be discussing today the quiet risks in component manufacturing that don't get talked about a lot. So welcome, Jess, and we're excited to hear what you've got to kind of tell us today.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. I think this is an interesting topic, a lot of different ways we could go with it, but it is one of those that there are a lot of risks with component manufacturing. So talking a little bit about it and getting people just thinking about certain areas of their business where they might be overlooking or they could be doing something a little bit better. So excited to talk about it.
Yeah, so most risks in component manufacturing don't always show up as emergencies, right? Like they show up as these small repeat issues that everybody just kind of learns to deal with over time. And maybe those aren't the risks that you see in your profit and loss statement. They quietly affect your time and your people and your operational consistency. And so why do these quiet risks get overlooked, and kind of what are some large examples of things that you see in those quiet risks for manufacturers?
Well, I think, an easy one to talk about is quality control. And, what that means to each individual component manufacturer and each individual employee at each of your operations is probably different, but it's consistently delivering on a quality product as to meet or exceed expectations. And really, that's one where you're probably not going to notice it out of the gate unless you're actively managing it. But your customers will start voting with their feet. They'll start looking at alternatives. And when they're looking, you're losing. And that's one of those to where, quality is really a way, to establish an expectation and to maintain your, supplier of choice status with each of your customers.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing you say is that quality control inconsistencies is a credibility issue, not just a quality issue. And I think one thing we see pretty regularly is when your quality control depends on just one person or depends on the memory of one person, mistakes can slip through unnoticed as you're going through day-to-day operations. What are some of the most common examples of QC inconsistencies you've seen?
Obviously there's the things we measure, but I think kind of to your broader point of reliance on just a singular person, well, that makes sense in a lot of ways that, okay, I'm just going to silo it over here. I'm going to give it to the new guy or the new gal and, say that, QC is important to us, but it's really not that important because, we're going to put the time or effort into it. And that's really, if you measure it, you're going to be able to understand it and you're going to be able to improve it. So a lack of measuring your quality management system or your QC inspection reports, that is probably one. But, when it gets right down to it, what, the recommended QC inspection or even digital QC, what they measure, it's the placement, it's the length, it's the height, it's making sure it's the right lumber. It's making sure that, the plates are there. I was a manufacturer and we had plates, not get applied, and that should have been caught earlier on. They should have been there to begin with. But that's just a good example. I mean, it's anything that can go wrong, likely will at some point. And the QC is an opportunity to be able to have those checks and balances in place before it gets to the customer. And that's a problem. If the customer discovers it before the truss is installed, that's even better. But if it is installed, then you've got bigger problems. And how do you repair that? So that's, a number of things. But, you can run the gamut with, everything from, gaps between the members to, rotation of the plate, the embedment, the wrong plate, can be. And some of those get tricky, especially when you're using high strength plates versus regular, there's all those different things that, can potentially become a problem. But really, kind of coming back to what is your approach? And is it a system approach or is it just, okay, I'm going to shuffle it off to one person and hope for the best?
So, how can digital QC help standardize inspections and reduce errors across the shifts?
That's a good point or a good question kind of that you're leading me into is you make sure it's done the same way every time.
Mm.
And the photography, the image capture portion of it allows for people to, there's a lot of accountability there. It's not like, oh, well, this one may or may not pass, or, I can kind of, write it off that way and make what might be a marginal inspection into a passing inspection. It really is a tool that's going to hold you accountable, and it's going to hold you to the same accountability across your employees. So if you have multiple people doing the inspections, there's going to be a standard there that, allows it to perform. Plus, the TPI one, which I think we'll probably talk about here in a minute, it mandates how many inspections you need to be doing. So helps you with accountability that way and making sure that, you're not missing inspections and that you're doing them similarly enough to where you get similar results. If Joey does the inspections and nobody ever passes, but Sally does them and everybody, is just building the best trusses ever, and they're separated by one or two lines, something's probably up because I'm guessing there's some crossover there, there's training and whatnot. So that's really where, you can have a little bit more of a discerning eye when it comes to the results of the inspections, which there is a human element no matter what, method you're doing. And it's trying to take that out and trying to even that across, all inspections to know what you're getting as a manager, to make sure that you're keeping an eye towards that and knowing, is quality improving or is it declining, and what do you do about each situation?
So, my next question is two parts. So, first, how do those inconsistencies that you may see in QC impact field installs and builder trust? And then, how do you ensure consistency when you're using digital QC, whether it's pairing with a QA program or something else?
Yeah. So the first part first there, every component manufacturer I talk to, I mean, if I ask them, they're going to tell me they build the best trusses. Well, if everybody's the best, then everybody by default is average. So, if you kind of come into it with just a little bit of a humble pie, maybe all the mode, if you need to make it feel better for yourself, think of yourself as average. And how do you prove that you are at least average, if not above average, and excellent and with that? So that's where the consistency is. And, when it comes to framers or whoever's doing the install in the field, they've got their gripes. And if you're not listening to them, and I mean, it's easy for me from my perspective, I go into the framer groups on Facebook and, I'll search trusses if I'm really feeling, like I want to see something. But that really, you can see it. It's not going to be the trusses you probably made, but it's going to be the ones that somebody else, maybe in your market or anyway, the communication allows for the impressions of a component manufacturer thousands of miles away to have an impact on you, the perception of your product. So when plates go missing or the wrong size or the lumber's wrong, or it's just the trusses are poorly built and they're, they look terrible when they're installed and not for whatever reason. It might not have anything to do with the manufacturing, but it's the chain of custody between when they go through the press to when they're going to be installed. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things that can and will go wrong there. So not saying it's all on the manufacturer, but control what you can control. And that's the part of quality control that you want to, impact. So really it comes into, you are what you end up being and what you manufacture. So, it is one of those that the framers, they will have their gripes. And, if it's missing plates or plates that are obviously, out of rotation. And that was always one of my favorites, is somebody would stand at the end of a row of trusses and they'd try to compare plates from truss to truss to truss. And you can see the discrepancies. And if they're off a little bit, that's to be expected. But then everybody becomes a QC person. And that's one of the unfortunate parts during the framing process, is it very easy to compare trusses to trusses when you get them all lined up and you can look down on, specifically bottom core joints and splice, joints as well. But those are the things that, that just erodes the trust. And you don't want people to use your product because they feel they have to and they don't have any other option. You want them to use your product because it's the best solution for what they have for their construction project.
So what are some things that, we can use with digital QC, like job site packages, a QA program that can kind of bring about that consistency in not just the manufacturing process, but also that chain of communication from manufacturer to installation?
Well, I'll touch on the QA part first. And if I forget to talk about the job site, bring me back to that, Abby. But it is one that the quality assurance audit is not a replacement for QC. It's not to perform your QC. Now, I've heard and there's people out there that they'll hire the QA to come in and do inspections for them. Well, essentially that's outsourcing your QC. It's not performing the audit. The audit's purpose and intent is to make sure that your staff is doing the quality control inspections as intended by TPI-1. And that's one where, I hear stories of some people, I don't have time for that. Or it's, well, if you don't have time for QC, when are you going to have time to, go out and repair it? Or, to improve the product once you have a mistake? And invariably, everybody's going to have a mistake, but it's one of those, if you don't have the time to do it right, when are you going to have the time to do it again? So that really comes into play with QC. And that's where the importance of pairing it with a QA program that's going to hold you accountable. And if they're not holding you accountable, then you should probably find a different one. And I don't care if it's, one that's affiliated with SBCA or anything else, but that's the entire point. And you should be looking for the mistakes to where if you find them, it's better than your customer finding them or a building inspector finding them. So there's a lot of different things there that are important to make sure that they have some teeth to it. And, ask for them to be hard on your staff, ask for them to make sure that you're doing everything that TPI-1 stipulates that you should be doing. And that's going to make you have a better product. Now, that's probably the baseline, and that's where you start from. And you can always work up from there. Digital QC and the QA can work together really nicely. Digital QC, by nature, has a reporting function that allows you to track over time. You're not going to have to go through the paper report. So you can actually pull it up on the screen and see, are you passing more inspections or not? And is it because of, the tolerance has changed? Is it because of, you've had a different inspector, or is it that you're holding yourself to a better accountability? I would rather know as soon as possible that there was something wrong with the truss than as late as possible, because then, you get into some really dicey issues. Now, I asked you to make me come back to job site packages. So my memory is not completely gone. So, talking about job site packages and how it all flows together is, component manufacturers assume a lot when they ship a load of trusses. They assume the people on the job site are going to receive them, treat them well, and, install them, and they're capable of installing it. We don't really have a mechanism, outside of just prior experience, and hopefully you've worked with the customer before. But the job site package allows component manufacturers to explain, the basics of installation. And that's really, there's a responsibility there of sorts for component manufacturers to make sure that their customer knows how to get the trusses from the ground to the roof. And, that's, there's a lot of heights involved, varying in some projects, and there are going to be, heights that, a fall or, anything, even if it's a truss that falls, could be damaged, and that causes a problem. So, a lot of different ways to look at that, but making sure that your customer or whoever the customer hires to install the trusses has at least a baseline. And you need to do that on every single shipment of trusses. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to, a bad situation happening. And what typically happens after a bad situation, well, people want to try to make it right. And a lot of times that's through the court system or whatnot. So it's one of those to where let's avoid it all to begin with, and let's help our customers understand how to install the trusses. And the job site package is the great start with that. And I would even go beyond that. And it depends on the project. Like if they're 6-foot garden sheds or something, okay, well, we need to get that right too. But if they're 58-foot vaulted trusses, there's some unique situations there too. And are you having that conversation with whoever's going to install it? And it's really just being a good steward of the industry, of making sure that the product gets installed the way it was intended, and the use of the product, contributes to the overall construction project as well.
Right. And I think especially when you are doing this every day, you live and breathe components and you live and breathe trusses. It may be second nature to you, but the people installing it might not be something that they do every day. They might only install, a couple of homes a year that use trusses or something like that. So I think when we're talking about those communication gaps, it's so important to make sure that you have an SOP that's going to ensure that you are able to replicate this process no matter who is installing those trusses for you. So how do job site packages help communicate the right information clearly and help reduce those surprises that you can get on site?
Well, before I get to that, I want to expand on your point that you made there because it was a great point that, you may have worked with the same customer, it might be XYZ framing company or XYZ construction that you've
Mhm.
shipped 1,000 jobs to, but you don't know what their staff is like.
Yeah.
Is it been the same staff for all of those projects, or is it somebody that's brand new? Or if it's somebody first time being a foreman and, they're going out and, now responsible for the truss installation. And it's a lot different when you're the person, if you're the helper or the second helper, I don't even know what the org chart, the proper, the apprentice, or,
Mhm.
I'm sure there's some other disparaging names we could use for the people that are the most junior. But every time you take a step up in responsibility, it's a lot different, especially the first few times you
Mhm.
do it. So we're assuming that a lot with that as well. So that's where, that job site package and, hopefully, the people that are installing the trusses have it in advance. Hopefully they take the time and they really have a well thought out plan. Best framers I know, the ones I talk to and the ones I would model my own project after, talking to them, the preparation is the key. And
Mhm.
when it comes time to actually start doing the work and there's a crane on site and you're getting charged an exorbitant fee for that, the tension rises and you need to perform. And the thing that helps for that performance is having a well thought out plan. And that starts with
Oh.
understanding everything that's in that job site package, all of the different trusses. Hopefully they've gone through the truss design drawings. They understand where the continuous lateral restraints are going to be, how they're going to impact, the top cord temporary bracing, the bottom cord bracing, all those different things. It's a lot to go through. And it starts with that
Mhm.
planning. And, if they don't have a plan, probably going to have an issue. And a failure is not a catastrophic event. It could be that it takes an extra 3 hours,
Mhm.
which could be several $100s in crane time. It's extra time for people on site. It delays when you're able to get on the sheathing. And it's another thing with those projects. So it's one of those where it all adds up and, having the understanding of what's in that job site package, which is really the summary of BCSI, is a very important part of that process. So, great point to that. And my brain, I did forget your question. So would you mind re-asking it, please?
I would not mind. So, how do job site packages help reduce surprises on site? How does it help communicate the right information on the field?
Well, I think that's probably the same point, just said a little bit differently, that it's
Mhm.
the planning. It gives you the insight and it causes you to think like, okay, how am I going to store these trusses to where they're not going to end up in a mud bog and they're going to be all twisted and warped because it's uneven. So from when they come off the truck or when they're first delivered to like, how are you going to get the first couple trusses set? That's one of those to where you don't have a lot to work with until you get a few trusses set. And then,
Mhm.
beyond that, what are the next steps going to be? And what are the special considerations? If it's a long span truss, if it's vaulted, if it's a hip set, there's so much variability. And the cool part about the housing industry in our world is not, no two jobs are the same. I mean, it could be the same
Well,
track house, 100 times over, but the lot's going to be different. The grades are going to be different. How do you brace them to the inside or the outside? So there's all kinds of different things. And it really comes down to that planning. And it's a communication tool and it's
mhm.
meant to be, this is the baseline primary communication. Hopefully it sparks conversations or it's like, oh, hey, how do I get more information about that? And that's one where, the job site packages of summary sheets of BCSI as well as some other things to just get them thinking along those lines. It's not, it'd be nice if it was everything, but I don't know if you could ever be to that point, but hopefully makes them ask the question. If it's of the component manufacturer, hopefully they're able to answer it and they have a well enough understanding of BCSI where they can just rattle it off or they can go to they reference the document. I remember when I'd visit job sites, I always kept a few copies of BCSI in my vehicle just to be able to hand out or to reference or to point and show as opposed to just say, oh yeah, thumb and eye and, check the wind and okay, yeah, that'll be good. This is a way to really help articulate, certain instances and making sure that we can, get the trusses in place as best we can.
Yeah, I think that there's one other piece of using job site packages that I think gets overlooked a lot, and that's the shared language that you have now established between manufacturer and on-site. Whereas you may not have used the same language for certain things in the field versus in the manufacturing setting, and those job site packages can help close that communication loop along with digital QC so that there is reduced friction and there is a standard that is kind of being set of how we install the trusses and how we are looking at our final product. And, I think that translates to not only in the plant, but the builder and the inspector, because that job site package doesn't just fly off into the wind after the framers use it. So I think there are some other articles there too that we can touch on in terms of that language sharing and that full communication loop.
Yeah, that's a great point, because if people are talking about installing the rafters that come with the gussets, they probably are from an era that, yes, you can understand that. And it'd be nice if the component manufacturer didn't have to translate, 7 different languages of construction, and that we could get a lot of those things aligned. And, that's part of the effort SBCA is making, even with some of the language in BCSI and TP1 and the IBC IRC. We're always looking to streamline that and to make it to where it's easy to understand, and really to establish a culture that prevails that, if you're able to easier communicate about it, more likely you're going to be more efficient and safer as a result.
Definitely.
So before we shift gears, we are going to pause here and we will get into what happens when important knowledge lives with just one person and how standards and digital QC can actually protect your team and your operation, not slow it down, when we get to part 2 of this episode. So stick with us and we'll pick right back up in part 2.
Thanks for listening to Component Connection, brought to you by SBCA. If there's a topic you'd like us to explore in a future episode, email us at podcast@sbcacomponents.com.